A little information. Hello, welcome to today's Textile Talk presented by Carolyn Ducey, Curator of Collections at the International Quilt Museum. We are so glad you are here. I'm Laura Chapman and I am the Communications Coordinator at the IQM, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's program and to tell you a little bit about the museum and our textile talks. So while you're gathering a little bit of information about the International Quilt Museum, we are located at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and we are home to the world's largest collection of publicly held quilts. We have pieces dating from the 1600s to today. We represent more than 55 countries and various types of media in terms of quilt making. And we draw from that world-class collection to share research and exhibitions with our audiences around the globe. Our mission at the International Quilt Museum is to build a global collection and audience that celebrate the cultural and artistic significance of quilts. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about us, please visit us at www.internationalquiltmuseum.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and we invite you to subscribe to our Quilt of the Month newsletter to learn more about our collection and our programs. We're also so happy to be partnering with everyone for Textile Talks. This is a series of weekly presentations and panels, discussions brought to you by the International Quilt Museum, Modern Quilt Guild, Quilt Alliance, San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. The programs are held online at 2 p.m. Eastern and 11 a.m. Pacific each Wednesday, April 29th through June 3rd. We'll also have recordings of each of these talks available for future viewing. So actually, if you would like to, you could go when you're done watching today and see Sakwa's presentation from last week, which was wonderful. And we hope you'll also join us again next week when we have a presentation from the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. Stay tuned for more details on that. So again today, Curator of Collections Carolyn Ducey is here to present Cultivating Culture, Botany, Gardening, and 19th Century American Quilts. Dr. Ducey oversees new acquisitions and ongoing care of the museum's collections. She has curated a number of exhibitions, including Chintz Appliqué, From Imitation to Icon. She is the author of multiple articles, monographs, and books, and she co-edited American Quilts in the Industrial Age, 1760 to 1870, with Dr. Patricia Cruz. Dr. Ducey earned a Master of Arts in American Art History from Indiana University in 1998, and her doctorate in Textiles, Clothing, and Design with an emphasis in Quilt Studies from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. If you have any questions for Dr. Ducey throughout the presentation, please submit them in the Q&A box that you'll see on your screen, and we'll take some time to answer them at the end. With that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Dr. Ducey. And again, welcome everyone.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's just a pleasure to be here with everybody today. In addition to my bio that Laura just shared with you, I'm really proud to be a member of the Studio Art Quilt Associates Board. It's been a delight to be involved and to meet so many of the members and be involved. So it's great to partner with everybody. I'm really pleased to do this program, which actually I want to give a shout out to two people who really did a lot of the research in the background. This was information that we gathered for an exhibition that was done in 2000 called A Flowering of Quilts, and Dr. Patricia Cruz and Susan Curtis did amazing research for our catalog, and this show, or this lecture, is drawn from their some of the information that they did. I was involved in writing all the individual labels for the quilts, so it was super fun to be able to do a lot of research on gardening, which was something I love and I really didn't know much about the history of, so it was really fun. So let's get started. So one of the most interesting things that I learned while we were doing this research is how prevalent gardening and botany were in the lives of 19th century women. Not only was it something that was promoted as a great exercise for women that got you out into nature, but it was also promoted as something that was morally uplifting. So that if you understood the spirituality of nature, if you were out among nature, it was something that really was supposed to make you more fulfilled intellectually, spiritually, morally. And as the women of the family, that was especially important during this period, because women were really the leaders of the home. They were responsible for making sure their family was, you know, following morals, following, you know, the right path in their lives. And so gardening was something that was really pervasive. I think it's interesting because most of the quilters that I know also not only do they love working with textiles, but they love doing gardening as well. So I think it's something that the beauty of it, the idea of working with your hands and creating something, they both go hand in hand, quilting and gardening and botany. So it'll be fun for us, I think, today to explore some of these different options. So like I said, gardening was really believed to be one of the ways that you could promote moral behavior, that you could really encourage your family along the right path. And natural beauty especially was something that was really highly prized. Writers for gardening magazines really extolled gardening as an important activity. And I want to quote a couple of these authors from the 1800s. Walter Elder stressed that gardens were important because they were, quote, refining and moralizing to the young and exalt the national character. Andrew Jackson Downing, who was the son of a New York nurseryman, wrote in his book, Cottage Residences, that beautiful homes and gardens would serve a moral purpose as, quote, an unfailing barrier against vice, immorality, and bad habits. I bet you didn't know that when you were out weeding your garden. Women were also really encouraged to study botany, which was kind of unusual in the 19th century. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher, in his book called Elements of Botany Addressed to a Lady, approved of a mother teaching her daughter botany because it, quote, abates the taste for frivolous amusements, prevents the tumult of the passions, and provides the mind with a nourishment that is salutary. Who knew? I included this slide because actually here at the University of Nebraska, we were one of the universities that really promoted botany for women and approved of this study of botany. This may have been in part because as a Western university, we had a little bit more freedom than perhaps an Eastern location might have. It was also because of the influence of Professor Charles Bessey, who was a late 19th century professor at the university. And under Bessey's tenure, nearly 150 women graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree, and that's really amazing. And this is one of my favorite jokes, and I hope you get it. I don't know if you're familiar with Austin Power and his fembots, but actually University of Nebraska had the original fembots because that's what the female botany students called themselves. So if you need a movie to watch, there's one for you. You can go check out the fembots. So there were a lot of reasons and different elements behind the popularity of gardening and quilting and things that really promoted it to women, and really also were a reason why it translated so well into textiles and to quilts. And one of those first things we're going to talk about is the actual discovery of these plants. In the 18th and 19th century, plant hunters were exploring the world and bringing seeds, seedlings, and plants back to the US. I find that just so fascinating because we take for granted that we can go to the nursery and pick out about anything, but these plants were really rare and unusual to be found in the US. Of course, the first plant the plant that was most popular was roses. And roses actually came from China in the mid-18th century. China was actually called the mother of gardens because they had such a wide botanical diversity in their country. So a number of different plants were brought from China, including azaleas, lilies, primroses, and rhododendrons. And we see that influence in the detail here on the upper right is an actual chintz fabric and then a red and green applique below it. And another just beautiful example, we do see probably roses most popularly in quilts or variations of them. Zinnias and nasturtiums came from South America. I love these wonderful, it was so much fun to do this presentation, to look at all of these different variations of the way women created their flowers in both chintz fabrics, chintz applique, and in red and green applique. Dahlias, which come from Mexico, were actually the most popular flower for gardens in the 19th century. And garden catalogs devoted more space to varieties of dahlias than any other species. Tulips, however, had a really, really special place in people's hearts, and they were a very unique flower, something that became really a luxury item when they first were discovered. They came from Turkey and in the 17th century and were imported to Europe. Of course, we know that in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, they became very popular and widely grown there. In fact, in 1637, the economy was really affected by tulip mania. And here you can see the most popular type of tulip that was actually, people were buying and selling and trading for tulip bulbs, trying to propagate the most interesting varieties. And in fact, at that time, a single tulip bulb of a really highly desirable plant could cost as much as someone's salary for a year or the cost of a home. And people began to risk all of their wealth and all that they could, and sometimes too much that they could, on acquiring these beautiful tulip bulbs. And ultimately, it very quickly led to a complete economic crash in the Netherlands because people could not afford these, could not keep taking these risky actions with their economics. Tulips are just really an amazing plant. And I love this quilt, a red and green applique from the Civil War era by Lucinda Ward Honstein. Many of you might be familiar with one of our most famous quilts, the Reconciliation quilt, which was made by Lucinda. This was a piece that came to us after we contacted Lucinda's family, her descendants, talked to them about her quilt. They were very relieved to know that their quilt was in a public collection. It was going to be preserved. And about a week after that phone conversation, the tiniest box you've ever seen came to me in the office. And I opened it up and just kind of folded as tightly as you could. In that box was Lucinda's tulip quilt. So it's always really exciting to be able to bring these quilts back together, these family pieces. So this quilt is near and dear to my heart. Another element of the 19th century that really promoted gardening and quilting as well was the development of garden catalogs. And this was in part because of the Industrial Revolution and because printing presses had been developed. So in the middle of the 1800s, we begin to see all of these different catalogs. They included drawings, oftentimes line drawings, that were really easily translated into quilt designs. They also included things like floral hair weavings, lace designs, knitted and crocheted flowers, embroidered flowers. They really were inspirations to the gardeners. And here's an example of, in many cases, drawings that were done for garden illustration or for garden catalogs were almost literally translated into designs, actually almost copied. So this is from Robert Ferber's catalog of the 12 months of flowers. And you can see the similarity in this wonderful chintz design of the same era. Another factor that really impacted quilt making and gardening was a better distribution route for catalogs. So the development of mail order catalogs and the availability of purchasing seeds was something that really promoted the opportunity to create gardens. Seeds were inexpensive, they were easy to ship. And South American and Mexican plants like coreopsis, coxcomb, and hollyhocks became really popular. And here's a wonderful coxcomb quilt. Coxcomb plants actually are the only plant variety that are cultivated simply for their ornamental qualities. They last for 6 to 8 weeks, and that makes them something highly desirable when you're displaying or arranging floral arrangements. In the 19th century, we also see what we call a language of flowers developing. So many flowers had particular symbolism. Primroses symbolize the passage of youth or childhood, poppies, the fast passing of time, and anemones, the winter of life. This particular quilt, and if you can see my mouse here, or my pointer up here in the second row, you see a cross kind of embedded in this floral arrangement. That and the fact that this quilter used an unusual black background suggests that this might be a mourning quilt. We don't know that for certain, but it is possible. And it may be then that all of these different plants that this maker created on her quilt have a symbolic message, or were also expressing some of that love or longing or sadness for missing someone. You'll notice in a lot of the quilts that we're looking at today that in some cases, the flowers that are represented are really represented really accurately and realistically. So especially in early chintz quilts, for example, many of those fabrics are very easy to recognize. As we move later in the mid-century and we get into more red and green applique, which followed chintz, then we see a lot more stylization of the flowers, and they become a little bit less difficult to recognize exactly. Still close, still representational, but not like the realism that we see in these in the early quilts. We're also going to see that realism come back in the era of the crazy quilts, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, where again we see makers really trying to replicate things in much more exact ways. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about another phenomenon that we found really fascinating when we were researching our exhibition, and that is the correlation between garden design and quilts. So early in the 19th century, Americans were fascinated with European gardens. They were looking at Italian, French, Dutch, and English gardens, and those were considered the epitome of style. The first style, an early style, was the parterre de broderie. And I looked that up, and that literally translates as embroidered garden. And I think it's really interesting that one of the terms that we have often heard used to describe early chintz quilts was broderie perse, which means Persian embroidery. These gardens and quilts both were meant to emulate Oriental carpets and embroideries. You see these garden beds that are set out in really elaborate symmetrical designs, and they often look very much like an Oriental carpet or an embroidery. And in quilts, we see, in chintz applique, we see kind of a similar feel, where we see these different areas laid out, these beautiful serpentine borders, and just that celebration of these individual plants. Closely originating with the original designs. And here you can see that border from the quilt and a symmetrical or a beautiful vining border in an actual garden that was published in 1895. An interesting relationship between those. And just another really stunningly beautiful chintz quilt from the mid-1800s. This quilt, I think, is one of the most elegant and refined in our collection, and I absolutely love it. If you notice in the slide, especially like here along the vine, but throughout the entire white background of this quilt, you see stuffed work. So the maker has gone through, done her quilting, and then gone back through the back of the quilt and kind of separated threads to add more batting to give the quilt that real three-dimensional quality. So what's really fascinating about this quilt is that it's so beautiful on the front, but when you look at the back, all of those, the stuffing that was added to the quilt is kind of still really evident, still coming out through all the holes she created. So the back of this quilt looks like a beard. It's got so much of this batting that's coming out of it that the maker obviously just really didn't take much time and concern with the back of the quilt. Evidently, she wasn't worried who was going to see that, and put all of her time into that beautiful pattern. Also in the 1800s, in the first couple of decades of that century, in the 1827 Gardener's magazine, a scholar wrote an article on quilt or on design, and it was translated then into gardening. So R.R. Reinagel wrote that beautiful objects are characterized by, quote, something that is a well-ordered whole in opposition to something that is in a state of chaos or confusion. He states that straight lines radiating from a center point or object form a pleasing shape. And here we see that in a Mexican rose quilt from the 1860s. I love, love, love that color combination, which I would never have chosen, but yellow and red, what a great combination. Reinagel continues to say that even more visually pleasing are curving lines radiating from center points. And here in this Rose of Sharon or Wig Rose, we can see that. It's interesting how that curved line gives this quilt such movement. So I'll tell you that this is a design I would never touch. Look at all those points. We did do a count one time to see how balanced this quilt maker did with her points and how accurate she was. And there are multiple different numbers of points in all of that sashing. So visually it works, and that's all we need to worry about, I guess. One of the next styles that became really popular in garden design was called gardenesque. And this is an English garden style that the object was, quote, to produce highly elegant and polished forms. And the style was supposed to create a harmonious whole from separate elements. And I think we really see this in album quilts of this period as well. On a Baltimore album quilt here. So here you can see how the individual elements are really beautiful, but they also are very contained within each block, and that overall whole creates such a dramatic quilt. This is one of our Baltimore album quilts are some of the finest applique quilts. They were meant to perhaps to emulate chintz fabrics, but these are a really unique group of quilts, a relatively small number made, and all of them come straight out of Baltimore. We don't know who made them. Absolutely, we have some ideas, but history's been a little bit vague and has not been helpful in finding records that tell us how these quilts were linked. But it's obvious through their designs, the repetition of designs we see from quilt to quilt, and from the actual fabrics that were used in the Baltimore albums. There are shared fabrics among them. So we do feel like there was a common designer or group of women who were designing these quilts. And current research suggests that a Methodist group of women, led by one great designer, would create a block, a top, or a finished quilt as you ordered it. It's interesting because in some quilts you see designs that were obviously shared and have a really high-end quality, really elaborate and beautifully constructed, combined with blocks that are much simpler. And I think you can see that if you look at the center block and that arrangement, and then you go up to the top order where you see a much simpler, maybe one that they were devising their own format for. But these Baltimore albums are truly some of the most special. This quilt also has monuments to some of the soldiers who are famous due to the Mexican-American War. So we see Zachary Taylor in one block, and these other monuments that were actually in Baltimore that were replicated in the quilt. And another album quilt here. This one has some amazing fabrics in it. So if you look at the upper row here, you'll see an elephant carrying an individual in what they call the huda, which is a carrier. And then at the very bottom, we also see figures following a gentleman riding a camel. So some really interesting fabrics in this album quilt. We also see a number of different elements in gardens that we see in quilts that were promoted as a way to create your garden. And here's an image from the 1895 Gardener's Catalog of a basket flower bed. And you literally created a basket and planted your fabrics kind of behind it and created this flower bed in a basket. And in quilts, we see that in the number of different urns, the vases, all of these kind of pieces were encouraged for use in your garden, and we see it quite often in quilts as well. And here is a really beautiful chintz quilt where the basket of flowers is repeated all the way around that outer border. A basket, this is another basket from a Baltimore album quilt in the collection, one of our most famous. And this basket is one of those elements, like I said, that we recognize from quilt to quilt. So it looks kind of like a wicker basket like you'd find in your garden that's been translated into this quilt pattern. And we also have, of course, numerous basket quilts. We see quilts done in chintz, baskets done in chintz applique. We see them done in red and green applique, and we see them in piece designs like we see here where the triangles have been all put together. This was a quilt that was one of our founding couples, Robert and artist James. This was one of artists' favorites. She had this hanging in their quilt storage area, and it was one of the very last that came to our collection because she loved it so much. And if you're familiar with a very early publication called the Quilt Digest, I believe this was on the cover of the Quilt Digest, one of their issues. Really beautiful. I think I have it upside down. I goes both ways, but I think that center block is upside down, isn't it? Oh well, it's fun to look at either way. So then the last type of quilt design or garden design that we see in towards the later half of the 19th century is this naturalistic garden. And this kind of correlates to the development of crazy quilts. Crazy quilts incorporate individual blocks done with all kinds of different designs, you know, cut out. The idea was that you really didn't want to see straight lines. You wanted to see a kind of this crazy conglomerate of blocks. And we think that crazy quilts developed in the late 1800s after the 1876 centennial celebration in Philadelphia, because that was one of the first times that Americans were really exposed to Japanese art. And we see so much of the Japanese influence in crazy quilts. So you can see in this quilt, there are fans, the horseshoe in the center, and all these beautiful details. And every single shape that's cut out and appliqued in crazy quilts are also then covered with really elaborate embroidery. And the more types of stitches you could include, the better. Crazy quilts were never meant to be something that you used on the bed or used in a functional way. They were meant to be shown in your parlor, thrown over your piano, over a table. And just like gardening, these were really a symbol of your taste and culture. This is a way that you could just visually let people know that you were a woman of substance, that you're a woman who could indulge herself in the time that it took to make a crazy quilt. Obviously, it was a woman of leisure that would make a quilt that was so extravagant that really served only a function as a way of saying something about you and your social status and yourself as an individual. Many of the flowers that we see in crazy quilts were tall, stiff stem plants like lilies, daisies, and coxcombs. And in this quilt, we see goldenrod, which is the state flower of Nebraska. This quilt is particularly interesting because, as I said, in crazy quilts, we return to this image of quilts as a much more realistic portrayal of flowers. So this artist has used a number of different techniques to create her flowers. And so you see them in the center. The roses here are done with ribbon embroidery. She's using a plush Erisine thread to create her goldenrod here, velvets to create her roses, and a really thick satin stitch here in the lower corner to create that eagle and flag. So in addition to this quilt functioning as a popular style of quilts, as this kind of visual representation of yourself, it also is a patriotic quilt, and it has the inscription here in thread says 14 AC, and that's the 14th artillery company. So she's also using this quilt as a way to really promote her devotion to the United States and maybe to a particular soldier who was fighting. This is a small size. Crazy quilts tend to be much smaller than bed size because they were just meant to be a throw. So it's evident from all of these 19th century quilts that women really shared their tactile sensation, their love of using their hands, both in gardening and in quilts. And that this love of natural beauty was something that crossed over, that these two kind of styles, these two activities of women's lives that were really prevalent went hand in hand. And they embraced the study of plants and art as a basis for their spiritual and intellectual improvement, and as a means to demonstrate their virtuousness and their cultivated taste. Thank you so much, everyone, for this opportunity to share these quilts from our collection.
And thank you, everyone who submitted questions. Carolyn, we actually have a few for you.
Right.
Several people asked, and so I wanted to make sure everyone saw the answer. The question was, because you had remarked on Lucinda's tulips and how it came in a small box. So I looked up the answer. The question was, what are the dimensions of Lucinda's tulips? And according to our database, it's 76.5 by 77 inches or 196 by 194 centimeters.
And I do think the box that it came in was no more than about 8 inches square. So I was not expecting a quilt when I received that box. Let's put it that way.
The next question we have is, were medicinal plants ever used in quilts?
You know, I think they were, but in our research, we looked at the fact that, early gardens were very much based on the need for producing medicinal plants. But as the 19th century went on and science became more prevalent, women were able to turn to doing more gardening just for the sake of enjoying their garden or for bringing plants into show because they didn't need to do the medicinal plants. So it was certainly something that was done earlier. And I have not really looked into that, whether we see those medicinal plants in quilts. I would imagine that there's a real overlap, but I do not know that absolutely.
And then we have a few questions regarding chintz, which is, I know, an area of expertise and love for you. So the first question is, I noticed on the first tulip slide, the chintz tulip is shown with several flowers on one stem. Were there tulips of that nature available then?
Not that we know of. And that's something we recognize really quickly with the chintz, is that you often see multiple varieties of flowers on the same stem. That was a really good observation. We think that was really more a design choice, something that would sell. Chintz fabric is the more you could make it appeal to the masses, they like it. I'm not aware of flowers that share the same stem like that. And maybe someone else is, but I kind of doubt it.
The next question is, there appears to be a consistent use of chintz in the early 1800s. Is this due to a lack of textile production in the US at that time?
Really good question. And yeah, we do think that's a big part of it. From what we know of chintz, and it's really difficult, the challenge when you try to do the history of fabrics is that fabrics were described by type. So you would say a 4-colored chintz, an 8-colored chintz, a 12-colored chintz, and that would impact the cost, the expense of buying that fabric. But they don't describe them in any greater detail than that. So it's almost impossible to know what actual design in the chintz is being sold in those fabrics. But we do believe that, England was the primary seller of fabric to the US. And in the early 1800s, it was an incredibly lucrative market. And so it was actually prohibited. You could not export the technology and the machinery to produce printed cottons outside of England, at least not to the US. So that way we were forced to go back to England to purchase our fabrics. And they, the early style of one of the earliest styles we see is chintz fabric, and it's done in chintz and used in chintz applique and in chintz pieced quilts. But I think it was just, there were other small scale cottons coming over as well. We do see those in quilts as well, but the large scale patterning and the beautiful colors of the chintz, if you had the means to purchase fabric, that was what was selling, and that's what was popular. And when you see those early chintzes, particularly the right about the 1800s to 1820, they were spectacular. They were beautifully colored. They were so detailed. Then as people are trying to create that look, but yet cut expenses, the fabric becomes less and less detailed. The US doesn't really get into the textile production scene until about the 1830s in any large scale numbers. And they tended to really focus more on small scale calicos rather than chintz. But it is interesting because in our research, we watched chintz. It was popular until about the 1840s. I think as America became able to supply people with different fabrics, they didn't buy the more expensive fabrics. And the manufacturers in the US who tried to produce chintz couldn't do it with the same kind of quality. People were cutting corners. They weren't willing to put all that time and energy into making something. They wanted to sell it. And so we see a real change in the overall look of chintz fabrics. And that actually may be where the term chintzy comes from, because the fabrics really are much less quality. They're much less refined. They just don't have that same beauty. And that is probably why eventually chintz kind of disappears from the quilting vocabulary.
And one more chintz question that I saw right now was, what was the style called where you go through the back of the chintz applique?
The back of the chintz applique. We were talking about stuffed work. Some people use the term trapunto. Here at the International Quilt Museum, we try really hard not to use a term like, say, example, trapunto or broderie purse. Those are terms that you'll hear, but we don't know if the quilter, the maker, actually would have used a French or Italian term for her quilt. So we use a much more descriptive term, which is why we call it stuffed work. And it really is, in this slide that I have up right now, you can really see it in, this is a detail of the quilt I was talking about, where you see the tulips and the daisies here. And you can see that three-dimensional quality that it creates.
And then I was just to follow up on a question we had earlier, which was about medicinal plants. Someone shared that foxgloves are medicinal plants that were used on printed chintz.
Great.
Then going on, we have a lot of great questions. Do you know if any of these quilts were made with plant dyed fabric? Curious because I make all my quilts with plant and food waste dyes.
You know, that's certainly something that we know individuals have done, is dyed their own fabrics, but so we will see that in some quilts. But I think that in my experience, and I'm not a dyer, I don't have a lot of expertise in this area, but I think that with the what the difference was and why people tended to go towards, I mean, and all of these dyes were plant dyes. What we're seeing is madder and indigo, weld, mineral dyes. So these are all natural dyes, but what the mordants used in producing these industrially made the colors much richer, much darker, much sharper than what a hand dyer could do. So definitely people were doing that. But if we're talking about these high-end quilts, and really up until about the 1830s, making a quilt was an expensive endeavor. And we see them coming out of households where they had the time and they had the means to really buy fabric and spend time on them. There probably were other quilts that were hand dyed that were used, but they were used up. What we see, and we call this the bias of survival, we see quilts that were saved. That's why they have survived for 200 years, because they were carefully preserved. And interestingly, that need to preserve them was passed down through the family. So I do think there probably were both, but predominantly what we see are these manufactured dyes that really held their dye. They were not as fugitive, is the term that we use, as the hand-dyed plant fabrics.
And so I guess this is kind of a follow-up with that is, are the dyes used in this period of time botanical or plant-based, possibly indigo, weld, and cochineal?
Definitely. Cochineal was something that was used early. That kind of faded out pretty quickly because you could use madder. And the reason why, you know, all of this goes back, this is, you should get me started talking about this because it's one of my favorite topics, but it all goes back to dyers in India who were really experts on how to create dyes using a mordant, because cotton is not like wool. You cannot dip cotton. Typically, you cannot dip cotton into a dye and achieve your colors. You have to print the dye on the fabric. And a mordant is basically the glue between the fabric and the dye, and it holds that onto the surface. And by using different mordants, and mordants were iron, tin, metals, all kinds of different combinations of things, they call them recipes. By using different elements in your mordants, you could dip a fabric into madder and you could get 6 different color shades, color hues. So really it was the mordant dyeing that came out of India starting in the 1600s that really just pushed people to kind of discover its secrets in the West versus India and the East. Also, China was involved in this. In fact, textile production was one of the things that led the Industrial Revolution, because it was such an amazing market. People knew if they could print the cottons, they could sell them. And so there was a constant battle between companies to find the right recipes to preserve and keep your recipe from being discovered by other individuals. And that's why England tried so hard to hold on to that market, because it was really lucrative. And eventually it did get out. So I love that history.
We had a couple of questions regarding broderie purse. One is, what term do you use? And then the other was, what would have been the American term for it?
Good questions. You know, we don't really know what the term that women used for their quilts were. The one term that I think we know from the middle 1800s is album. And that's because we have written documents where women talk about making album quilts and making them for church purposes. So we use the term chintz applique or cut out chintz applique because, again, it's a descriptive term. And so we don't want to use a term that we don't know that was used in the early 1800s. The problem is that just like, say, quilt patterns, we don't have records of what women called their quilts necessarily because they weren't written. Even in diaries and in letters, people would talk about my floral quilt, my quilt with flowers, but they wouldn't really give us a name that they used. And so that's going to take a lot more research, and we're hopeful that those records are out there, but women often didn't write that, so we don't know.
And we had just another chintz follow-up question was the quilting chintz polished cotton?
Chintz is typically polished. That's one of the ways that you define chintz. It was typically started out made in England for furnishing fabrics and curtains. You could, there are rooms that are entirely decorated and ensconced with chintz. So it was typically a large scale fabric and a polished cotton. We don't know exactly how they did the polish. There were descriptions in early Indian books where they would use an egg wash and apply that to the quilt. We feel like if that was the case, not a lot of quilts would have survived because rodents would have been so attracted to them. You could use heat setting, and you could also use a burnishing technique where you just shown that, you know, if you apply a lot of pressure and heat to cotton, it almost kind of melds the threads together. And so that's what chintz ends up with, is a super tight weave. And oftentimes people don't quilt through their chintz fabric for that reason, because it's really hard to get your needle through it.
And we have about like 10 more questions to get through, and I'm gonna, if you have any more, go ahead and sort them through, but we're gonna try to get through the rest of these in the last bit of time. One of the questions is, why were so many utilitarian quilts used or close to a square?
I'm sorry, quilts?
I'm sorry, why were so many utilitarian quilts close to a square? I think, meaning like.
Oh, good point. You know, we do see more rectangular shaped quilts than we do see square. We did have a student do a research project one year looking at the size of beds and was there any correlation to bed size and quilt size. And there was not, because there were no standard sizes for mattresses until the 1890s, I believe, maybe 1880s, but late in the 19th century. One of the most fascinating things I discovered when I started at the International Quilt Museum was that our chintz quilts are our largest quilts, and you would think it would be the other way around. But as I said before, chintz quilts were a status symbol. If you could make one, it showed a lot about you. Just like there's a great article in the New York Times once about how if you could get a full-length portrait painted and hang it in your house, that said a lot about you. So your chintz quilts were status symbols. They did have really large, heaped up feather beds. There is some scholarship that suggests that your textiles were to pool on the ground, so your curtains, your quilts would actually hit the ground. We don't know that to be a fact, but it really wasn't until we get into the red and green style, which is the earliest red and green we know of is 1839. That's when we see the more rectangular kind of double bed size that is much more typical. And that stays pretty consistent from then on. We don't go back. You know, some of our chintz quilts are 10 feet by 10 feet. They are huge. So it's kind of, you would think it would be the opposite way, but it's not.
Our next question is, why is the coxcomb so well known in quilting?
Why is the
coxcomb?
You know, I think it was just because it was such a popular flower to grow and it's so visually appealing. We see it in lots and lots of quilts. So I think it just goes along with what people found appealing in their garden is what they reproduced on their quilts.
And then we had a question, victory gardens are coming back into the national conversation. Was there a period when quilters turned to vegetables as subject matter in addition to flowers?
You know, I would imagine that most quilters that were, say, middle class grew vegetables just like they grew flowers. I don't know that, and I don't know a whole lot about victory gardens. I do know that in times of, you know, when we're challenged, everybody is set out to grow vegetables. So I don't know much about that, but I do think that the vegetables and the flowers went hand in hand.
Did you see those do we see those in quilts though? Reflected in the quilts?
You know, that's a really good question. I think I'd have to do some more research on what defines a victory garden to know if we see it in quilts. I don't know.
Okay. There was a question, I've seen quilts created by leaf pounding. Was that used in earlier times as well?
I am not familiar with quilts done with leaf pounding. Now, I've seen cyanotype. We just had an exhibit here at the museum of quilts that use that technique of a chemical that it changes when it's exposed to the sun, but I'm not familiar with that technique at all.
Okay. I'm going to put these two kind of together. I'll read them both out loud. The first is, what trends are you seeing that connect quilts and gardening and contemporary works? But then also there was a question of, how do you see modern quilts today that revisit floral elements and themes in light of these 19th century quilts?
That's a really good question. And I do think that the love of floral imagery in quilts has been pretty steady. I think in today's quilts, what I see is the use of incredibly beautiful hand-dyed fabric. So people are still doing floral imagery or really quilts of nature, but they're using their own fabrics and they're dyeing them so that they create this much more ethereal, natural look to them. The other thing that we've seen recently is painting with thread, and thread again gives you that ability to create nuances and shadow and dimension in quilts. But I think, even like I said, the quilters I know, most of them, I haven't done a poll, but I'd say most of them love gardening. And I think that love of nature is kind of inherent in us. And that's why we know today it's so important to get outside. We know that getting outside for a walk makes such a difference in your mentality. So I think that there's something with that love of nature that still translate directly into really any kind of art form, but especially quilts.
Now we're into our last three questions. One was, can you talk about the class, economic, and racial context? Gardening and planting meant different things for well-to-do women and for working class, farming, or enslaved women.
Well, absolutely. You know, a woman of means was not out in the garden for the purpose of feeding herself. That was something where if you had means, you had staff, you had people who did that for you. And of course, someone like a middle-class person like me, like many of us, we garden for a whole different reason. We garden because, and probably did a lot of vegetables because that's the way we supported our family. And I mean, I love to do vegetable gardens because I think it is the most amazing thing to be able to grow my own food. And that's a luxury for us, but I'm sure that was a survival technique for most people. And I think that's true up until very recently, you know, until we're able to go into a grocery store and buy things off the shelf. I think growing your own vegetables, farming, all of that was a huge part of individuals' lives. And just like today, there was a very top percentage of individuals that had others who did that for them, and that they didn't have to be involved in that production. But I think really that's just was a fact of life. Now, urbanization really affected that in the mid 1900s. A lot more people moved to cities, but they still probably went to their, you know, the local farmers market is what we call them today, and bought those farm products there, but still very much were dependent on those individuals who were doing the farming.
And as the flowers become more stylized, how do you determine what they are? Were there standard ways that people typically stylize the same flowers?
You know, there's not, and that's interesting because red and green applique, where we see this stylization, you can get a basic kind of format or look that's very similar to another one, but really every red and green applique is a little bit different than the other one. When we did our exhibition, we asked a botanist to come and look at the quilts and tell us what she saw in them. So there are some where she could say, oh, I know exactly what that is, I know exactly what that is, but there are a lot that are so general that they really can't be identified as a specific flower.
And then for our last question, we have somebody asked if we have any quilts from Gee's Bend.
We have 2 Gee's Bend quilts in our collection, but we do have one of the most exciting and significant collections in our collection overall is the Robert and Helen Cargo African American collection from Alabama. Robert Cargo collected in the Alabama area that included Gee's Bend. However, he bought quilts from individuals. He went around the country, he saw quilts out on clotheslines, he stopped in, he purchased quilts. When we acquired quilts from him, we did get those 2. That was right before the Gee's Bend phenomenon. So we have a collection that closely relates to the Gee's Bend designs and the phenomenon, but not exactly the Gee's Bend area.
And I just wanted to remind everyone, thank you so much for watching today. We had questions asking if today's lecture would be available at a later time. It will. We will have it on our YouTube channel, and we'll also be sharing it with our partner organizations who will share it on social media and through email. So kind of however you found out about this today, look to those sources to receive the recording of it later. And with that, we also had a question. Someone was curious to see the reconciliation quilt that we had mentioned, and so you can view it on our website. And actually, if you Google the reconciliation quilt, you'll see a lot of examples, but I'm actually going to just take over the screen for one moment and see if I can share our picture of the reconciliation quilt, just so you can kind of see in context with Lucinda's tulips. And so here we go.
There it is.
I apologize, my screen is a little messy. There we go. And on our website, if you go and look, you can actually hover over it and you'll be able to get kind of a detailed viewing of it. But with that, thank you again, everyone, for watching today. Thank you, Carolyn, for the wonderful lecture. And we will see you all again next week when we have a presentation from the San Jose Quilt and Textile Museum.